Again, and welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your host, Eric Tait, and with us on this session is Dr. Alan Singer. Dr. Singer, welcome again to Media Watch.
Oh, Eric, thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. I know you're a history professor, doctor, PhD in history, but tell our viewers a little bit more of your background, because I know you blog for Huffington Post as well.
I write for Huffington Post on educational issues. I teach history classes at Hofstra University, but my primary responsibility is teacher education. I was a New York City high school teacher before I shifted to the university. And so I write about education issues and historical issues at Huffington Post.
Fantastic, because as far as I'm concerned, all this stuff is connected, and most of it is connected to our educational system and how good, bad, and indifferent it is in this country. So let's jump off on your latest blog for Huffington Post, because it had a very interesting headline. Please.
Well, I started with a New York Times article because the New York Times had a feature on the New Hampshire campaign of Chris Christie and Marco Rubio. And in the campaign, Marco Rubio is denouncing college education. And he's denouncing college education. He argues that a liberal arts education is an effort of the left-wing conspiracy to indoctrinate young people.
Indoctrinate.
Indoctrinate. He used the words indoctrinate, at least according to the New York Times. And I'm looking at this, and I'm a left-wing historian at a liberal arts university, and I say, that's not what I do.
Left wing. Okay, so your politics tend to be on a liberal side.
Politics tend to be on the liberal side, okay. But that's not what my job is.
Right.
My job is to get young people to think about issues that they would not have thought about otherwise. To get them to question, to get them to empathize, to get them to have concern. I'm not really interested in them agreeing with me, but the purpose of a liberal arts education is to challenge people to think, which is also the purpose of a secondary school education.
To challenge them to think critically.
To think critically, yes.
To actually weigh pros and cons and listen to the merits of the different arguments.
And then to arrive at a conclusion based on evidence, which again is something that you don't see in the Republican primary debates. Mostly you see blowhards, and you don't see any reasoned discussion based on evidence.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit just to pin down the Rubio bottom line about the purpose of a liberal arts education or lack thereof.
This is the thing, and I talk about it with teachers who are working doing social studies teachers in secondary schools. We want students to be literate. We want students to be comfortable in math, but we want students to be prepared for college and career. But we also want students to have a commitment to being an active citizen in a democratic society, to be able to think about issues, to evaluate positions, and then come to decisions and to act on them. If our students do not become actively committed to democratic society dies. It's not a passive society. That's when you sit on the couch and you watch TV. But change and justice and equity come about because people play an active role in society. That's what we want teachers to help young people to become.
Okay. Laudable goal. But you don't have to be either liberal or conservative to have that goal in mind.
Exactly.
And so basically his charge is that the Northeast liberal arts colleges are just basically indoctrinating students into a political way of thinking. That's his charge. All right. I don't know much about Marco Rubio's background in education. I believe the blog did go into the fact that he floated through about 3 or 4 different colleges before he ended up with a degree.
And floated through high school as a C student.
I mean, I have nothing wrong with C students because a lot of people just don't buckle down when they're in high school. They may be extremely intelligent, but because they're out partying, they're doing X, Y, and Z, they end up with C grades. I will not hold that against him. My beef is, after you get your C, do you start to use your critical thinking skills when you go into public life. And based on what the structure or the tenor of the argument that the New York Times articles seem to imply, and what your blog's talking about, is he doesn't seem to be in any way, shape, or form thinking in terms of what's best for students as opposed to what's best for his political agenda.
Marco Rubio has a constituency of one. There's a wealthy Florida car dealership real estate man by the name of Brayman, who is his primary financier.
Brayman, is that spelled B-R-A-M-A-N?
Yes.
Okay.
And Brayman has financed Rubio's career from the start. So while Rubio may need other people to vote for him, his whole campaign, we're talking about, I think he pledged $10 million to get the campaign started, has been in response to Brayman. Not only did Brayman give him the money for the campaign, but when Rubio needed money for to launch his law career, Brayman hired him as a lawyer for his company. Brayman has even hired Rubio's wife as a consultant for the company. So, and I wish I could say that Rubio stands out as the only one. But one of the things that has happened in American politics is you have people who are running for office have wealthy sponsors, and they don't represent the public, they represent their sponsors.
All right. That gets to the heart of what we've been talking about on Media Watch for some time. The bottom line is, and actually both parties are guilty of it, you've got these super PACs who raise a gazillion amount of dollars. Millions of dollars. I think Jeb Bush's super PAC was $103 million just coming out of the gate to supposedly blow his Republican rivals out of the water from having a big war chest. It didn't blow anybody out of the water. In fact, it brought more people out of the woodwork. But there are a number of super PACs around for all the Republicans, pretty much, and I believe there's a PAC that's supporting Hillary Clinton.
Yes,
I don't know what the name of the PAC is, but the bottom line is, because of the Citizens United decision, soft money, hard money, just money period is just flooding the American political system, and so therefore it's not about the little man on the street going into the voting booth, because the money is determining who he's going to go into the voting booth to vote for. One of the things I think that happens is that they do not really want the American public to be educated. An educated public, and
the argument for educated public dates back to Thomas Jefferson, who argues that an educated citizenry is the basis for democratic society. They don't want an educated public, because an educated public is going to say, whoa, what's going on here? How come these people are able to dominate everything? I mean, just to give you a sense, and just to relate to media, in Las Vegas, one of the main Republican financiers, a man by the name of Adelson, he was being brought up on charges, and the newspaper was supporting the investigation. He just bought the newspaper and shut down the investigation.
Yeah.
And matter of fact, he ordered the newspaper to investigate the judge.
The interesting thing about it is that sale broke, I guess, about the early part of December, middle of December, and it's the biggest paper in Nevada, it's Las Vegas?
Yes.
And because the workers at the establishment hadn't a clue who had bought the paper, they basically raised a stink, say, well, who the heck are we working for?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, the rest of the media was asking, well, who the hell bought the paper? And sure enough, a few investigative people said, well, all the signs point to Sheldon Adelson, it points to blah, 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 and after they pull the curtain back from the wizard's lair, as in the Wizard of Oz, it turned out that the family of this billionaire were behind the purchase of the newspaper. Now, of course, the family is just a euphemism for the billionaire himself, because it's his money that's buying the paper. But to get back to your argument, tell us a little bit about the investigation that he tried to shut down.
Well, he runs casinos, and his casino in China was accused of it's not actually China, it's Macau.
Macau.
It's
yeah.
a little piece of China that belonged to Portugal.
There are these islands that are sitting off the mainland, folk, and they've been gambling havens for centuries. So the big casino owners who used to be in Las Vegas all went to Macau. Steve Wynn, Adelson, all these folk, because guess what? They could make more money over there, probably with less restrictions than the laws here.
So he's been accused of having relationships with illegal activities. What they are, it's not clear to me. And if he is found guilty of this, he could lose his Las Vegas licenses. So he has been fighting this very, very vigorously. And the courts, a particular judge who's sitting on the case, has been trying to hold him to the line. And now what he did is he's used the newspaper to launch an attack on the judge.
Right.
Money controls politics in the United States. And they do not want an educated public, because an educated public would not stand for this.
Okay, no argument from me. We have on this show, and you've guessed it on it more than once, talked about the deliberate attempt for the dumbing down of the general public in this country. I remember we talked about the fact that years ago, not just 2 years ago, almost 10 years ago, if not more, came into my inbox. This teacher from Pennsylvania, somewhere in the sticks of Pennsylvania, wrote this amazing article or op-ed piece that found its way into my inbox, where she basically delineated how much she had seen the dumbing down of her students. And as far as she was concerned, the school districts that she was working for was in collusion with the people. And basically she was saying they just want robots to plug into factories, robots who can't think, robots who can't vote for the right choices when it comes to elections. It was an amazing, amazing article. And I wish to this day I had saved it and written down that teacher, because she was a teacher, but she came right out and said, this is a deliberate dumbing down of our young people because they don't want knowledgeable voters who can think for themselves.
Look, it's what part of my big opposition to Common Core, because what Common Core does is it breaks down education into very small parts. And what happens is you lose the love of language, you lose the love of reading, the questioning, the imagination. And instead of learning to read and to think, what you do is you learn to decipher very small pieces, and you never draw the bigger connections.
Here's the quick definition. Common Core is based on this principle. Explain it real quick.
Common Core is based on the principle that reading can be broken down into very discrete skills, and that what we need to do is to teach kids these skills. But kids are not putting it together in the whole package. So they don't learn to love reading, to think about reading, to raise questions. What they're doing is they're constantly doing skills-based pieces.
And this Common Core has been defined as you need to know this little module for this part, you need to know this little module for this part, you need to know this little module, and if you all graduate from high school knowing all these little modules, we will think that you're educated.
Well, no, and how we know that you know the modules is because they're testable.
Right.
So what ends up happening is each little piece is designed so it can be tested, not so you have broader understanding.
And who's making the money from the testing?
Publishers, Pearson, and others. Now, there's been a big pushback on Common Core, and somewhat successfully. Parents last April, and centered in New York State, led a massive nationwide campaign called the Opt-out Movement.
Right.
And the opt-out movement in New York State, I think about 25% of the families refuse to have their children take the test.
Let me tell you, to pick up on that, don't lose your thought. I saw a headline in Newsday, I believe it was the week of Christmas, big front page headline, opt-out movement continues to grow.
Yes.
That was a Newsday front page headline. So evidently that issue, at least on Long Island, seems to be of major concern. You don't put a front page headline like that unless it's a big issue. So continue on the opt-out movement.
Well, the opt-out movement has now had an impact both on statewide and national politics. Governor Cuomo has pulled back on his demands for testing. President Obama has said, well, maybe we've had too much testing. And under the new Educating Students to Succeed Act, there will be some pullback on the testing regimes. So the opt-out movement, a parent-led movement with teacher support, has had an important impact in American society. My concern is just pulling back on the test is not going to guarantee that we really educate and teach kids how to think.
You're talking about the full holistic approach
Yes.
of the complete development of the child while you're trying to educate the child and make sure that they're not just existing in discrete silos, but they're actually learning to put this stuff together.
On Monday night, I took my granddaughter to her drama. She's 11th grade. She's 11-year-old, 6th grade. And she was complaining about her reading class because in her reading class, all they do is they read fact-based text and they annotate, meaning they take notes in a very specific format. And this is a little girl that loves to read. And she is reading a book now called The Book Thief. And she's just telling me all about the book. She was dying to tell me about the book. She needs to do that in class. Yeah. She needs a group of friends and a reading club in class. That should be what English is, not just breaking things down into component parts. And I think that they're taking that away from kids.
Look, the stress on testing is not only causing more stress on students, but it does not seem to be. The first assessment that came through on this new initiative, or one of the more recent, seemed to prove that the ability to deductively interpret what you've read seems to have declined as a result of the emphasis on these Common Core things and these technological assistant things in classroom. I'm not sure whether it was Pew or one of the other testing or survey folks. They actually tested educators to find out, did that initial push on technological, introducing more technology and technology-based aids in the classroom, what were the initial results? And it turned out that instead of increasing the ability to read and comprehend and whatever, the skills decline. so there seems to be some thought to that maybe they may need to take another look at how they're introducing technology into the total curriculum or teaching-based curriculum.
Reading requires you to slow down and think. When I have arguments with the books and the articles that I read. When I take notes, rarely do I write down information. Mostly what I write down are my arguments and my questions.
Okay.
And that's what we want kids to do. We want kids, when we talk about engaging with the text, it's not just what did it say, but how do you respond to what it said? Because that's when you're drawing the connections, that's when you're drawing thinking. But that also requires conversations with other people. Because that's what this means to me. What does it mean to you? What do you think about this, Eric?
It gets to the point of what kind of contextual basis are they providing these children? Now, for me, I always get back to a contextual basis thing because I remember that not only were you instructing teachers, you were also writing one of the better curriculum documents for social studies. And this is a kind of a curriculum-based document. I'm not sure whether the camera can actually see that, but lift it up, turn it that way, go this way. Yes, New York and slavery, complicity, and resistance. That had something to do with trying to put American history in the proper context as far as the 400 years of history in this country was. This is an award-winning social studies curriculum. What was the fate of that curriculum after it got written?
Well, it's the fate of multicultural education. What's happened in the United States in the last 10, 15 years is multiculturalism and the inclusive curriculum has been abandoned for skills-based learning.
Okay, so the historical context and the social studies grounding that these people at least should have to understand what country they're living in, what the history of the country is, has pretty much been abandoned. And so we're just all about skills and passing tests. What that says to me is that's part and parcel of why we're having problems with this entire society dealing with who and what this country is all about. They don't have a context for the history of slavery. They don't even have a context for the history of how they've treated the Native American population that was here when they got here. And so to just bring it full circle to where we are, you got these wackos, armed, quote, protesters, armed protesters. Nobody wants to call them armed terrorists, but these armed protesters talking about they want to get the federal government off their land and reclaim their land. But lo and behold, if they knew the history of that land and those people, that's Native American land that used to be part of one of the early Native American reservations that has since been totally decimated and wiped out down to this part and tiny parcel. So if anybody should be reclaiming their land, it's the native Paiute tribe that used to own that land. So that gets to the heart of why are these politicians not coming out and dealing with this kind of barefaced flaunting of law and legislation and what's in the best interest of the society and the country just because they're Mormons, white armed Mormons, or what's the reason?
Well, I actually, in this, it's very funny. My main source of news these days is the nightly show with Larry Wilmore.
One of my favorite shows.
Yes, because he has a real good sense of humor. And he actually had that picture. He said, well, we're going to return it to its rightful owners, and he picks up the picture of the
Native American. That would be cool. I'm sorry. I missed that episode.
Okay. But look, one of the things that's happened, and this is kind of interesting, the Fed, this was another, I think it was on Channel 4 last night. What happened is the federal government apparently has decided to let them just stay. They've taken over essentially a log cabin in the middle of nowhere, and they've declared their new independent nation. And someone said, let them just stay there. Soon it's going to start to snow.
Their new independent nation. Is that their latest phrase? Their new independent nation.
Yeah. So,
right.
But one of the things that's important about historical context, I'm working on a piece for Huffington for next week on Martin Luther King. And what I call it this, it's the other Martin Luther King. Because one of the things that's happened in Common Core is, everybody reads the I Have a Dream speech and they annotate it and they take notes because that's the Martin Luther King that they're selling us. Martin Luther King is a much more sophisticated, actually a much more radical thinker. So what I'm putting together is close reading of 4 different King speeches, but other speeches. The Riverside speech, where it comes out against war and imperialism.
His appearance at Riverside Church.
Yeah. But also the Where Do We Go From Here speech, where he raises questions about capitalism. Students need a broader understanding. That's why they, without a broader understanding, they could tell us that King just had a dream and the dream was achieved and then we're all better off. The story of the civil rights movement is Rosa sits down, Martin stands up, and Obama gets elected.
Yeah, right.
So we need to put together material that raises questions with this.
Contemporary-wise, it really is needed to actually put Dr. King back into his proper perspective because he basically was a disruptor of the status quo. He was not a saint. He was a man who understood that the establishment had to be shaken to its core for black people to achieve their basic inalienable rights that was guaranteed to all people under the Constitution, that were supposed to be reinforced by the 13th, 14th Amendments when the Civil War ended. All these things need to be put in their proper context. But I always go back to that historical context because before there was Martin Luther King, before there was Malcolm X, there were people like David Ruggles and the abolitionist movement. And even the abolitionist movement was fraught with internal squabbles between black abolitionists and white abolitionists and paternalism and non-paternalism. But the fact of the matter is, those were people who were bringing this nation to its conscience in the fact that all men are created equal wasn't meant just for white people with wigs on their head who own land. And because the Constitution was a flawed document and needed to be revised, they at least put a mechanism in there so it could be revised.
Which is why we have to study history, which was why we need to help young people have a critical focus on our world, which is why college and liberal arts education is important, and is why they do not want young people truly to be educated.
No, I fully agree with you on that issue.
Merrill Tisch, who is the chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents,
outgoing Board of Regents chairperson,
is leaving. Her position opens up. I've decided I'm going to use my Huffington Post column to launch a campaign to run for the New York State Board of Regents.
Listen, put it out there. Put it out into the ether.
I will then use my campaign to raise these issues.
Yes.
I don't
but
expect
no, be
to
serious
chosen.
about it. I know
because
it's got to be part of the inside club. I understand that. But if you put the candidacy out there for real, maybe the rank and file folk and even some of the politicians might say, maybe we do need somebody as the chair. What's the position actually called?
Well, it won't be chancellor. It'll just be regular. They'll put someone else as chancellor.
Well, go for broke. Go for chancellor.
Look what Bernie Sanders has done. Bernie Sanders, and it's the same thing that Jesse Jackson did in the 80s. They ran for president. They weren't going to get elected, but they ran for president to raise the issues. And that's what I'm going to try to do with the Board of Regents.
It's a very interesting thing. We only got about a minute and a half left, but Jesse Jackson's campaign is almost bookends of Bernie Sanders. If people would go back and look at the history, because there were white people in farm country who came out to listen to Jesse Jackson and actually supported Jesse Jackson. Donald Trump is the flip side of Jesse Jackson, because he's touched a disaffected group of people, just like Jackson actually touched a disaffected group of people. But if you go back further in history, Trump has also tapped into a more negative side of the American psyche, and that's the old George Wallace group
very
of folk,
much.
okay?
And Strong Thurmond.
Yes, and that's a street that's existed in American history for ages, folks. Huey Long back in Louisiana was going to run for president. He got assassinated, but he was a George Wallace type. He was a Donald Trump type. And so guess what? Trump has hit a nerve. Alan, I think he's going to be riding a lot longer because of these terrorist attacks. And because there's such a lack of understanding about history and context, a lot of people who are not so educated, who feel disenfranchised, they're going to flock to Trump's banner.
His biggest support.
We're out of time.
All right.
And we got about 26 seconds. Wrap it up, or?
No, I think everything you've said underscores the importance of real education, of students understanding history, and being committed to creating active citizens for democratic society. Otherwise, we go in a really negative direction.
And with that, this has been Media Watch, brought to you by EBT Educational Productions and MNN, and we'll catch you the next time.
Nice.